Morning, everybody. World War II ended in Europe in 1945. And in 1948, Joe Stalin decided to cut off Berlin from the West. And the reason he could do that is Berlin was in the zone occupied by the Russian army. And this began what was known as the Berlin Blockade, and the Allied response to it, the Berlin Airlift, which ended on this date, September 30, 1949. In February of 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta to talk about the fate of Germany when the war ended. And they decided to divide Germany into 4 sectors of occupation, and in the Russian sector, or Russian zone, was the city of Berlin, itself divided into zones. So this led to some tension in the years after the war. The city of Berlin was a ruin because of aerial bombardment and the combat between the invading Russian army and the Germans. And the German economy itself was a ruin, partly because of the legacy of the great inflation, represented here by a 2 billion mark note. So the Allies decided to create a new currency in West Berlin called the Deutsche Mark, which made Stalin really nervous because he didn't want West Berlin to become economically viable compared to East Berlin. So he closed all the access by road or rail between Berlin and what is now West Germany, the 3 western zones. And this put Harry Truman in a bind because he wanted to support West Berlin, but the Russians had about 1 million soldiers in their zone, and we had a fraction of that. But our general on the ground, Lucius Clay, felt that the Russians were bluffing, and that if the Allies were resolute, they could hang in there. So we looked at the various airfields in Berlin and noticed that Tempelhof was in the U.S. sector. This was a really big airport. It was one of the largest in Europe. A lot of its design was from the Nazi era, still there today, by the way, but not used for flights. So this is what happened. But the early weeks of the airlift were quite chaotic. There were some crashes, there were some near misses. So they brought in General Tunner, who had a lot of airlift experience from the war, particularly flying over the Himalayas into China. And he came up with a system where the incoming planes used a northern or southern route, and all the exiting planes used a center route. And this worked really well. It became a big conveyor belt. And they had flights coming in and taking off about every 3 minutes eventually. The C-54 pictured here was the big workhorse, pretty big plane for the time. And one of the ideas was to fly in either dried or dehydrated stuff because that took up a lot less room. Another thing they did was use Germans to load and unload the planes, and many of these Germans still had their World War II uniforms on. So men who had been enemies were now working together as friends. The Berliners got used to airplanes coming in and taking off 24/7. It got bigger and bigger and better and better. And one day, Gail Halvorson, this pilot, decided to drop candy attached to handkerchiefs. And this was a real hit. He became known as the Candy Bomber. Kids would line up waiting to get these handkerchiefs with candy and other little gifts. And this was part of a general PR win for the West, that the West was seen as being helpful, cooperative, bringing good things. And they brought in not only food and fuel, but also zoo animals like this camel for the kids to see. The military was so at peace with this that they started satirizing it in this kind of a Stars and Stripes publication. Well, this became a huge, like I said, PR loss for Stalin. He decided to end the blockade, did some political maneuvering so he could save some face. And on September 30, 1949, the blockade ended. Here's the monument to it. You see these airplanes. The 3 parts of the monument remind us of the 3 air corridors that were used. But it wasn't over for Berlin, was it? In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built. And then later, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. But Berlin became a great symbol of the Cold War.